He laughed when he saw her name on the staff badge. Emily Carter, serving drinks now. The room chuckled, crystal glasses clinking under golden chandeliers as his fiancée smirked beside him. Emily didn't answer. Her fingers tightened around the tray, pulse steady, eyes unreadable. He turned away, already forgetting her, until the music cut and the doors opened. A man in a tailored suit walked in, calm, controlled. Conversations died. "We're here for the acquisition," he said. Ryan frowned. "Acquisition?" The man's gaze shifted to Emily. "Congratulations," he added softly. "Your company is now hers." Ryan's smile cracked. Emily finally spoke. "It was a small job, wasn't it? From my wife to serving drinks." "That's quite the promotion, Emily." The laughter came easily to Ryan Whitmore, low and polished, echoing beneath the crystal chandeliers that dripped golden light across the ballroom. And for a moment, it seemed like the entire room followed his lead, a ripple of soft amusement passing through investors, executives, and women in silk gowns who sipped champagne like it was second nature. And Emily Carter stood there in a simple black uniform. A silver tray balanced steadily in her hands, the faint scent of citrus and sparkling wine rising around her as if it belonged to someone else's life, not hers. And she didn't flinch, not when his fiancée let out a quiet, delighted laugh, not when someone whispered her name like it was a story they had already decided the ending of. Because 5 years ago, she had stood in rooms like this as his equal, dressed in designer heels that pinched her feet and smiles that cost her more than anyone ever noticed. But now she stood still, shoulders relaxed, breathing slow, as if the weight of his words could no longer find a place to land. And Ryan stepped closer, adjusting his cufflinks with that same effortless arrogance that had once convinced her he was unstoppable, his cologne sharp and expensive, cutting through the air between them. "You always said you wanted something simple," he added, voice dipped in mock sympathy. And for a second, just a second, the room seemed to lean in, waiting for her to break, to defend herself, to remind them who she used to be. But Emily only lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in calculation, the faintest shift of her fingers tightening against the tray as her pulse tapped once, steady and controlled, because what none of them knew, what he didn't know, was that this wasn't her fall, it was her entrance, and the badge clipped neatly to her uniform wasn't a mark of failure. It was access, a quiet invitation into the very system that had once locked her out. And across the room, behind layers of glass and light, and carefully curated power, conversations continued, oblivious, as Ryan turned away from her like she was already forgotten, his attention drifting back to the crowd that fed his ego. And Emily moved again, smooth and deliberate, weaving through clusters of laughter and polished deals, her eyes catching reflections in mirrored walls, in champagne flutes, in the polished marble beneath her feet. Each step measured, each breath grounded, because she had spent the last year rebuilding something far more valuable than reputation. And as the music swelled softly in the background, strings blending into a rhythm meant to soothe and impress, a subtle shift passed through the room, almost imperceptible at first, like a change in pressure before a storm. The doors at the far end of the ballroom opening with quiet precision, and a man stepped inside, his presence not loud but undeniable, the kind that didn't ask for attention yet commanded it anyway. Conversations thinning, laughter fading into uncertain silence, and Emily paused, just for a fraction of a second, her grip loosening slightly on the tray as her gaze lifted, not surprised, not startled, just ready, while somewhere behind her, Ryan's voice continued, unaware, still playing to a room that was no longer fully listening. And for the first time that night, the balance of the room shifted, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that if anyone had been paying close attention, they would have noticed it. The way power has a sound when it moves, quiet, precise, and inevitable. And Emily Carter, standing in a borrowed uniform under borrowed light, felt it arrive. The man did not rush, and that was the first thing Emily noticed. The way he moved through the ballroom as if time adjusted itself around him, not the other way around. His dark suit cut with quiet precision, no unnecessary flash, no need to prove anything. And yet the energy shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a current beneath still water, and conversations thinned into murmurs, heads turning not out of Curiosity but recognition, because power, real power, did not announce itself. It arrived and was understood, and Emily lowered her gaze just enough to continue moving, weaving between tables, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but inside, something aligned, something she had spent months preparing for, because this night was never about humiliation, it was about timing, and timing was everything. She set a glass gently onto a polished table, the soft clink barely audible beneath the fading music, and for a brief second, her reflection caught in the surface, not the woman Ryan remembered, not the version he had reduced to silence years ago, but someone sharper, someone who had learned to exist without needing to be seen. And across the room, Ryan's voice faltered, just slightly, the rhythm of his charm missing a beat as he noticed the shift in attention, his brow tightening as he followed the line of sight that no longer centered on him, and the faintest irritation flickered beneath his composed smile, because he was used to being the focal point, the architect of every room he entered, and now, without warning, the room had chosen someone else, and Emily felt it before she saw it, the subtle pause in the air, the way people straightened, the way silence stretched just enough to carry weight, and then a voice, calm, measured, cutting through without raising itself. "Mr. Whitmore," the man said, and it was not a greeting, not really, more like a statement, an acknowledgement that required no response, and Ryan turned fully now, his confidence returning in a practiced motion, extending his hand, already preparing his introduction, his narrative, his control. "You must be here for the investment discussion," he said smoothly, but there was a question buried beneath it, one he had not planned to ask tonight, and Emily moved again, slower this time, positioning herself just close enough to hear, not as a server, but as something else entirely, something he still refused to recognize, and the man's gaze passed over Ryan briefly before shifting, precise, intentional, landing on Emily for a fraction of a second that felt longer than it should have, and there was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation, just confirmation, as if everything was unfolding exactly as expected, and Emily's fingers relaxed slightly against the tray, her pulse steady, grounded, because this was the moment she had been building toward, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with quiet, deliberate steps that no one had bothered to notice, and Ryan followed that gaze, confusion flickering across his face as he looked from the man back to Emily, trying to connect something that did not fit into the story he had written about her, and for the first time that night, his certainty wavered, just a fraction, just enough to be felt, and the man spoke again, his tone unchanged. "We will discuss terms shortly," he said, not to Ryan, but into the space between them, and then, softer, almost imperceptible, "Everything is in place," and Emily understood exactly what that meant, because she had reviewed every document, every number, every vulnerability hidden beneath the polished surface of Ryan's company. She had seen where it bent, where it could break, where it could be rebuilt, and she had said nothing, not when he laughed, not when they all watched, because silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation, and now, as the music faded completely and the room settled into a new kind of attention, Emily Carter stood still, no longer invisible, just waiting, because the next move was not his anymore. Ryan Whitmore had always believed he understood control, the way it moved through a room, the way it bent people, the way it shaped outcomes long before decisions were ever spoken. But as he stood there now beneath the fading glow of chandeliers that suddenly felt too bright, too exposed, something unfamiliar settled in his chest, not fear, not yet, but a fracture in certainty, and the man in front of him did not fill the silence, did not rush to reassure or impress. He simply existed within it, steady, composed, as if the next sequence of events had already been written somewhere beyond Ryan's reach. And then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "We have completed the acquisition," the words landing with quiet precision, and for a moment Ryan did not react, because the sentence did not make sense in the world he thought he controlled. His company was not for sale, not tonight, not without him knowing. And yet the room responded before he could, a subtle ripple of tension, of recognition, of people who understood financial language better than emotion, and Emily stood still, her tray now resting untouched at her side, her role already dissolving into something else, something truer. As the man continued, majority shares were secured through secondary agreements finalized earlier this week. And now Ryan's expression shifted, the first crack visible, small but undeniable, his mind racing through possibilities, through names, through deals he thought he had locked down, and finding gaps where there should not have been any. That is not possible, he said, the confidence still there but thinner now, stretched over something uncertain, and the man's gaze did not waver. It is already done, he replied, and then, finally, he turned fully toward Emily, not as an afterthought, not as a curiosity, but as the center of the decision. Miss Carter will oversee the transition, he said, and the words did not need emphasis, they carried their own weight, and the room shifted again, more noticeably this time. Whispers no longer hidden, eyes moving openly between them, recalculating everything they thought they understood, and Ryan followed that movement, his attention snapping back to her, really looking at her for the first time that night. Not the uniform, not the tray, but the stillness, the composure, the absence of reaction he had once mistaken for weakness. And Emily met his gaze, calm, steady, the noise of the room fading into something distant, irrelevant, because this moment was not loud, it was not explosive, it was precise, and she set the tray down on the nearest table with a soft, deliberate motion, freeing her hands, her posture unchanged but no longer hidden behind anything. And when she spoke, her voice was even, almost quiet, but it carried. "You were right," she said, and Ryan's brow tightened, confusion flickering again, because this was not how he expected her to sound, not defensive, not emotional, just clear. "It was a small job," she continued, and the faintest pause followed. Not hesitation, but control, the kind that lets words settle exactly where they are meant to. "It just was not the only one I had. And that was it." No accusation, no explanation, no need to justify the months she had spent rebuilding herself beyond the narrative he had assigned her, because the outcome stood there, undeniable, structured into contracts and signatures and decisions he could no longer undo. And for the first time, Ryan Whitmore did not have the room. He did not have the narrative. He did not even have the final word. And Emily Carter did not smile, did not celebrate. She simply stood there in the quiet center of a reality she had built piece by piece, unseen, and now impossible to ignore, while the man beside her gave a slight nod, as if confirming something already known, and the night, once designed to elevate one man, had shifted entirely, without noise, without chaos, into something else, something irreversible, and Ryan finally understood, too late, that she had never needed to fight him. She had simply stepped beyond him. The silence did not break all at once. It unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from something carefully stitched together. And the room that had once revolved around Ryan Whitmore now adjusted, subtly at first, then completely, conversations shifting direction, attention recalibrating, alliances already beginning to lean toward where the future clearly stood, and Emily Carter felt it without needing to look. The way the weight of perception moved, the way people decided who mattered next, and she did not chase it, did not acknowledge it, because this was never about being seen. It was about being undeniable, and across from her, Ryan remained still for a fraction too long, his hand lowering slightly from where it had once commanded attention, his posture intact but no longer effortless, as if something invisible had shifted just beneath his feet, and his fiancée glanced at him, confusion breaking through her polished composure, her smile faltering as she tried to understand a conversation she had not been part of, a reality she had not been warned about, and Emily noticed that too, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because she knew that feeling, the quiet disorientation of realizing the story you believed in was never the whole truth. And for a moment, the past flickered through her mind, not as pain, but as distance, late nights spent adjusting to his expectations, reshaping herself to fit into rooms that were never designed for her to lead, conversations where her ideas had been softened, redirected, claimed, and dismissed, all under the illusion of partnership, and she had believed it once, believed that shrinking was part of building something together, until the day she realized she had disappeared entirely inside his version of success, and now, standing here, She did not feel larger. She felt clearer, as if every piece of herself had finally settled into place without needing approval, and the man beside her stepped slightly forward, not to dominate the moment, but to finalize it, his voice calm, measured. "The board will receive formal documentation in the morning," he said, and that was all it took. The future stated as fact, not possibility, and Ryan's jaw tightened, the reaction small but visible, because there was nothing to argue against, no leverage left to reclaim, only the realization of how much had already been decided without him. And Emily turned her gaze toward him one last time, not searching, not questioning, just observing. And in that quiet exchange, something closed, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with finality, because she no longer needed anything from him, not recognition, not regret, not even understanding, and that absence of need was the most complete freedom she had ever known. And she reached for the edge of the table, not to steady herself, but to pick up a single glass, placing it neatly where it belonged. A small, ordinary action in a moment that had quietly rewritten everything. And then she stepped forward, not past him, not around him, but beyond him, her movement smooth, unhurried, as if the path ahead had always been hers. And behind her, the room continued to adjust, voices rising again, but different now, softer, more measured. The tone of people recalculating their positions in a landscape that had shifted without warning, and Ryan Whitmore stood in the center of it, no longer the axis, just another figure trying to understand when control had slipped from his grasp. And Emily Carter did not look back, because she already knew the answer. Outside, the night air felt different, cooler, quieter, as if the city itself had stepped back to make space for what had just shifted inside. And Emily Carter walked down the wide marble steps of the building with the same measured pace she had carried all evening, her heels soft against the stone, the distant hum of traffic blending into the background like a steady, grounding rhythm. And for the first time that night, she allowed herself a breath that was not controlled, not calculated, just real, filling her lungs with something that felt like release, not from him, not from the past, but from the version of herself that had once needed to be chosen, needed to be validated, needed to be seen. And now, she did not need any of it. And behind her, through the tall glass doors, the glow of the gala continued, smaller now, less significant, a world she had stepped out of without resistance, without regret. And she paused at the bottom step, her fingers brushing lightly against the cool metal railing, grounding herself in the present, because moments like this, quiet and unobserved, were where truth settled, not in the applause, not in the whispers, but in the stillness that followed. And a few seconds later, the door opened again, not with urgency, but with intention, and the man stepped out, his presence unchanged, composed, as if nothing inside had required effort. And he stopped beside her, not too close, not distant, simply there, sharing the same quiet space. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was no need to fill silence that already understood itself. And then, gently, he said, "You handled that exactly as expected." And Emily let out the faintest breath of something that might have been a laugh, though it did not fully form, her gaze still forward, watching the city lights stretch across the distance. "I did not handle it for them," she replied, her voice even, steady. "I handled it for me." And he nodded once, as if that answer confirmed something he had already believed, not about the outcome, but about her. And the faintest hint of approval passed through his expression, not loud, not exaggerated, just there. And after a brief pause, he added, "The board will want to meet you first thing tomorrow, 8:30 in the morning." And Emily turned her head slightly, acknowledging the shift from moment to momentum, because this was never just about tonight. It was about everything that followed, the decisions, the responsibility, the rebuilding of something she had once been excluded from. And she did not hesitate. "I will be there," she said, and there was no uncertainty in her tone, no trace of the woman who had once second-guessed her place in rooms like this, because she was no longer stepping into someone else's world. She was shaping her own. And a sleek black car pulled up quietly at the curb, its presence understated but precise, and the man gestured toward it with a small, respectful motion, not as an invitation she needed, but as an option she could choose, and Emily glanced at it briefly before looking back out at the city, her reflection faint in the glass of the building behind her, no longer a server, no longer a shadow, but not defined by titles either, just herself, fully, finally, and after a second, she shook her head slightly. "I think I will walk," she said, and he studied her for a moment, then gave a small nod, understanding without question, because some journeys, no matter how far someone could take you, had to be walked alone. And as he stepped toward the car, leaving her in the quiet edge of the night, Emily Carter turned away from the building, her steps steady, unhurried, disappearing into the rhythm of the city, not chased by the past, not pulled by anything behind her, because everything she needed was already ahead, and somewhere above, in the reflection of glass and light. The version of her that had once stood still under someone else's shadow no longer existed, replaced by someone who had never needed revenge, only the space to become undeniable. At 8:28 in the morning, the city felt sharper, cleaner, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped away overnight, and Emily Carter stepped into the glass tower that now carried a different meaning, no longer a place she had once been excluded from, but a space she was expected to define, and the lobby stretched wide with polished marble floors reflecting the soft morning light, the quiet hum of early conversations weaving through the air, and she moved through it without hesitation, her steps steady, her posture relaxed but precise, the faint echo of heels marking time in a place where time had always belonged to someone else. And now, it adjusted around her, and at the reception desk, a brief pause, just long enough for recognition to register, for names to align with new reality, and then a shift in tone, subtle but unmistakable. "Good morning, Miss Carter," the receptionist said, her voice measured, respectful, and Emily nodded once, not lingering, not absorbing the change, because she had learned that respect given too suddenly was often fragile, but authority built quietly could not be undone, and the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and as she stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflected her back, in layers, each angle showing the same calm, the same clarity, no trace of the uncertainty that had once followed her into rooms like this. And as the elevator rose, floor by floor, the city unfolding behind glass, she felt no rush, no need to prepare lines or defenses, because this was not a confrontation, it was a continuation, and when the doors opened onto the executive level, the air shifted again, quieter, more controlled, the kind of silence that carried decisions rather than noise, and the conference room stood at the end of the corridor, its glass walls revealing silhouettes already seated, waiting, not impatiently, but with the awareness that something had changed, and Emily walked forward, each step measured, the distance closing not as a challenge, but as inevitability, and when she entered, conversations paused, not abruptly, but in acknowledgement, heads turning, eyes assessing, recalibrating, and she met those gazes without resistance, not trying to prove anything, because proof had already been delivered in documents signed and decisions finalized long before this moment. And she took her seat at the head of the table, not dramatically, not with emphasis, simply because it was where she belonged now, and for a brief second, the room settled around that reality, the subtle shift of posture, the quiet adjustment of expectations, and then one of the board members cleared his throat, a practiced gesture of beginning. "Miss Carter," he said, his tone professional but edged with curiosity, "we would like to understand your vision moving forward." And Emily folded her hands lightly on the table, not gripping, not tense, just grounded, and she let a breath pass, not for composure, but for precision, because words, like actions, only mattered when placed exactly where they needed to be, and she began, her voice even, steady, carrying without force. "The company does not need reinvention," she said, and a few subtle shifts of expression followed. Surprise, perhaps, or expectation interrupted. "It needs alignment," she continued, her gaze moving across the table, not lingering, not avoiding, simply acknowledging each presence without giving any one of them control of the moment. For too long, decisions were made to maintain image rather than structure, and that has created instability beneath a polished surface. And there it was, not an accusation, not directed, but understood, the quiet exposure of what had been hidden in plain sight. And no one interrupted, because they could feel it, the accuracy of it, the clarity that did not need to raise its voice. And Emily leaned back slightly, not retreating, but allowing the room to absorb what had been said. "We are not here to fix what is visible," she added. "We are here to correct what has been ignored." And silence followed, not empty, but full, the kind that marked a shift from questioning to listening. And outside, beyond the glass walls, the city continued its movement, unaware that inside, something fundamental had already changed, and Emily Carter sat at the center of it, not as someone who had taken control overnight, but as someone who had quietly earned it long before anyone thought to notice. The room did not return to noise after she finished speaking. It settled into something quieter, something more deliberate, as if every person at that table was now measuring their words instead of performing them. And Emily Carter watched it happen without reacting, her hands resting lightly against the polished surface, her posture composed but unforced, because she understood this moment was not about dominance. It was about recalibration. And across from her, one of the senior board members adjusted his glasses, the gesture small but telling, a man used to certainty now reconsidering it. "You are suggesting structural changes," he said, his tone careful, not confrontational, but probing, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. "I am suggesting we acknowledge what is already there," she replied, her voice even, not rising, not pushing, simply placing the truth where it could not be ignored. And a subtle shift passed through the room again, quieter this time, more internal, the kind that did not show on faces but settled behind them. And to her left, another voice entered, younger, sharper. "And what about leadership continuity?" the woman asked, her fingers tapping once against a tablet before stilling. "Transitions like this create instability." And Emily nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition of the concern. "Only when the transition is unclear," she said, and the words landed clean, precise, without hesitation, because uncertainty was never about change. It was about lack of direction, and she did not leave space for that. "There will be no gap," she continued, her gaze steady. "Every department will receive updated directives within 48 hours, and operational adjustments will begin immediately after review." And the clarity of it moved through the room like a quiet current, replacing speculation with structure. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because they disagreed, but because there was nothing immediate to challenge. And Emily let that silence remain, not rushing to fill it, because silence, when earned, reinforced authority more than words ever could. And then, almost inevitably, a different question surfaced, one that had been waiting beneath the surface since she walked in. "And Mr. Whitmore," someone said, the name carrying a weight that had not yet fully shifted, "what role does he play in this transition?" And there it was, not just a question of logistics, but of history, of expectation, of whether the past still had a place in what came next. And Emily did not look away, did not soften, but she did not harden either, because this was not personal, not anymore. "He will be informed of the structural changes this afternoon," she said, her tone unchanged, steady, factual. "His current authority does not extend into the new framework." And the words were not sharp, not cutting, but final, the kind that closed doors without needing to slam them. And across the table, someone shifted slightly in their seat, absorbing the implication, understanding that this was not a negotiation, it was a transition already in motion. And Emily leaned back just enough to signal completion, not of the conversation, but of that particular question, because she would not allow the room to anchor itself in what was already behind them. And outside the glass walls, the city moved with its usual rhythm, unaware that inside, roles had been redefined with a level of quiet precision that left no space for reversal. And as the meeting continued, shifting into logistics, timelines, projections, Emily Carter remained exactly where she was, not pushing, not retreating, simply holding the center of a space that had once excluded her, now shaped by her presence. And somewhere, just beneath the surface of every word spoken in that room, one truth settled in completely, not announced, not debated, just understood, that control had not been taken, it had been replaced. The meeting did not end with a dramatic conclusion. It dissolved with quiet efficiency, chairs shifting back, devices closing, conversations lowering into private tones as each person carried away a recalibrated understanding of what the company had become overnight. And Emily Carter remained seated for a moment longer after the last voice faded, her gaze resting briefly on the empty chair across from her, the one that had once belonged to a man who believed control was something you held on to, not something that could move without your permission. And she did not linger in that thought. She let it pass, the way you let go of something that no longer has weight. And then she stood, smooth, unhurried, collecting nothing from the table because everything she needed was already in motion. And as she stepped out into the corridor, the atmosphere shifted again, not with surprise now, but with awareness. People who had once walked past her without a second glance now paused, not dramatically, not overtly, but just enough to acknowledge presence, to adjust pace, to recognize a new center of gravity. And Emily did not respond to any of it, not because she ignored it, but because she did not depend on it, her focus already moving ahead, past perception, into execution. And halfway down the corridor, a familiar voice reached her, not loud, but clear, "Emily." And she stopped, not abruptly, just enough to turn, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. And Ryan Whitmore stood a few feet away, no longer framed by chandeliers or crowds, no longer supported by the illusion of control that had once surrounded him so easily. And for a brief second, the distance between them held everything that had shifted, not just in the company, but in who they were. And he looked at her differently now, not with dismissal, not with certainty, but with something closer to recognition, though it came too late to hold meaning. And he stepped forward once, as if closing that distance might restore something that had already moved beyond him. "You should have told me," he said, his voice lower than she remembered, not weak, but stripped of performance. And Emily watched him without interruption, letting the words settle before they disappeared, because there was nothing in them that required a response, not anymore. And when she did speak, her tone remained even, not sharp, not soft, simply clear. "There was nothing to tell," she said, and the statement carried no accusation, no defense, just truth. And Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the quiet realization of what that meant, that she had not hidden anything from him. She had simply moved forward without him. And for a moment, he searched her expression, as if trying to find something familiar, something that connected this version of her to the one he had known. But there was nothing left to connect, no shared ground to stand on, and the silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but final. And Emily shifted her gaze slightly, not away from him, but past him, toward the path ahead. And that was enough. The conversation ending not with a closing word, but with absence. And she turned, continuing down the corridor with the same steady pace, leaving him exactly where he stood, not because she needed to walk away, but because she already had. And behind her, the space remained unchanged, the building still filled with movement, decisions, momentum, but Ryan Whitmore no longer stood at the center of it. And Emily Carter did not look back, because forward was no longer a direction. She had to choose. It was the only one that existed. The corridor seemed longer now, not because the distance had changed, but because everything inside it had. And Emily Carter walked through it with the same quiet precision, her steps measured, her breathing steady, her mind already several moves ahead, because what had happened in the boardroom was not an ending. It was a beginning that required structure, discipline, and a clarity most people only discovered too late. And as she reached her office, the glass door reflecting a version of her that no longer needed introduction, she paused for just a fraction of a second before pushing it open, not out of hesitation, but awareness, because spaces carry memory, and this one had once belonged to someone else, someone who had filled it with noise, urgency, and the constant need to prove control. And now it stood still, waiting to be redefined, and she stepped inside, the soft click of the door closing behind her sealing that transition without ceremony. And the room was exactly as it had been left, sleek, minimal, carefully curated to project authority rather than substance. And Emily moved slowly through it, not inspecting, not judging, just observing, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk as she passed, grounding herself in the reality of what had already shifted. And on the far side, The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city in clean lines and distant motion, a reminder that nothing stopped, nothing waited. Everything moved forward whether you were ready or not. And she placed her bag gently on the desk, not claiming the space with force, but with presence, the kind that did not need to be announced. And for a moment, she stood there, looking out at the skyline, letting the silence settle fully. Because silence, when chosen, became clarity, and a soft knock followed, precise, respectful, and she turned slightly. "Come in," she said, her voice even, and the door opened just enough for an assistant to step inside. Posture composed, expression professional but edged with the awareness of new hierarchy. "The department heads are requesting confirmation on the restructuring timeline," he said, holding a tablet close to his side, and Emily nodded once. The question already answered in her mind before it was asked. "Send the preliminary directives." "Within the hour," she replied. "Full implementation schedule by end of day." And there was no hesitation in her tone, no need to reconsider, because decisions like this were not made in moments. They were built long before anyone thought to ask, and the assistant nodded quickly, absorbing the instruction, the shift in pace, the absence of uncertainty, and as he turned to leave, he paused, just briefly, as if considering something more, then thought better of it, and stepped out, the door closing softly behind him. And Emily returned her gaze to the city. But this time it was different, not as an observer, but as someone shaping what happened within it. And her reflection in the glass no longer carried the weight of what she had been. It carried the clarity of what she had chosen to become, and for the first time in a long time, there was no noise in her mind, no echo of past conversations, no lingering doubt, just direction, clean and precise, and somewhere behind her, down the corridor she had just walked, Ryan Whitmore still stood in a place that no longer moved with him, trying to understand a shift that had already completed itself. But Emily did not think about that, because the past only held power when you carried it forward, and she had set it down completely. And as the morning light shifted slightly across the glass, marking the quiet passage of time, Emily Carter reached for the first document waiting on the desk, not as someone stepping into control, but as someone who had already taken it long before anyone noticed. By noon, the building had fully adjusted to its new rhythm, not loudly, not with announcements, but in the subtle efficiency of movement, emails sent faster, conversations more direct, decisions made with less hesitation, and Emily Carter sat at her desk with the same quiet focus. The first stack of reports already reviewed, annotated, and redirected with precise notes that did not waste space or time. Because clarity was not something she performed, it was something she maintained, and as the sunlight shifted across the glass behind her, casting long, clean lines across the floor, a notification appeared on her screen. A meeting request marked urgent, sender, Ryan Whitmore, and for a brief second, the name existed without weight, just text, just a remnant of something that no longer held authority over her day, and she did not react immediately, not out of avoidance, but because urgency defined by others no longer dictated her priorities, and she finished the paragraph she was reviewing before lifting her gaze slightly, considering the request with the same neutrality she applied to everything else. And then, with a single motion, she accepted, setting the time for 15 minutes later, not immediate, not delayed, just precise. And when the time arrived, there was no tension in her posture, no anticipation, just readiness. And the door opened without ceremony, Ryan stepping inside. His presence different now, not diminished, but no longer expansive, contained within. A reality he had not designed, and he closed the door behind him, the soft click marking a space where performance no longer held. And for a moment, he did not speak, as if adjusting to the absence of control he had once taken for granted, and Emily did not fill that silence. She let it remain, her attention resting calmly on him, not inviting, not dismissing, just present. And finally, he exhaled slightly. "You moved quickly," he said, his tone measured, attempting steadiness, and Emily inclined her head just slightly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or disagreeing. "The timeline was already established," she replied, her voice even, and he studied her for a moment, searching, perhaps, for hesitation, for something familiar he could still navigate. but there was nothing to find, and he shifted his weight slightly, the movement small but revealing. "You are making decisions that affect everything I built," he said, and there it was, not accusation, not quite, but ownership, the last thread of a narrative he was trying to hold on to. And Emily let the words settle before responding, because reactions were not where power lived. "What you built is part of the structure," she said, her tone unchanged. "But the structure does not belong to you anymore." And the clarity of it landed without force, but with finality, and Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, the moment where argument loses its ground not because it is defeated, but because it has nowhere to stand. And he looked at her again, really looked, as if trying to understand how the woman he had once defined by limitation now sat in front of him without any need to prove herself. And for a brief second, something almost like respect passed through his expression, though it came too late to change anything, and he nodded once, a small, contained gesture. "Then I suppose I should understand what comes next," he said, and Emily leaned back slightly, not distancing, but allowing space for the conversation to exist without tension. "What comes next is alignment," she replied. "You can either adjust to it or step away from it." And there was no pressure in her tone, no demand, just a statement of options that no longer required negotiation, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was complete, the kind that closes one chapter without needing to name it. And Ryan stood there for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, turning toward the door without another word. And as he left, the space he occupied did not linger. It simply returned to stillness. And Emily Carter lowered her gaze back to the document in front of her, not because the moment was insignificant, but because it was already resolved and outside. The city continued forward, unchanged, while inside, everything that mattered had already shifted beyond return. The afternoon settled into a steady cadence, not rushed, not stagnant, but precise, each hour folding into the next with a kind of quiet efficiency that did not need to announce itself. And Emily Carter remained at the center of it. Not by force, but by alignment, her decisions moving through the company like a current that adjusted everything it touched without disruption. And by 3:15, the final draft of the restructuring directive sat open on her screen, its language clean, deliberate, stripped of anything unnecessary, because clarity was not just communication, it was control. And she read through the last section once more, not searching for errors, but confirming intention. And when she was satisfied, she pressed send, the action simple, almost weightless, yet it carried through every department, every team, every layer of the company, marking a shift that no one could ignore. And for a moment, she leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window where the city stretched in sharp lines of glass and steel, the afternoon light reflecting in angles that felt both distant and immediate. And she did not smile, did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet sense of completion beneath her stillness, not because everything was finished, but because the foundation was now irreversible. And a soft notification chimed again, not urgent this time, just informational, confirmations coming in, acknowledgments from department heads, responses that carried a different tone than before, more direct, more aligned. And Emily let them pass without opening each one, because she did not need to read every response to understand the shift. She could feel it in the rhythm of the building itself. And a moment later, the door opened with a gentle knock, the assistant stepping in once more, his posture composed but his energy slightly quicker, reflecting the pace that had settled across the company. "The directives have been distributed," he said, his voice steady but edged with something close to respect now, not given out of habit, but earned through clarity. And Emily nodded once, acknowledging the update without breaking her focus. "Good," she replied, and there was nothing more to add, because the next steps were already in motion. And as the assistant left, closing the door softly behind him, the room returned to its quiet equilibrium, and Emily stood, moving toward the window with the same unhurried pace she had carried all day, her reflection appearing faintly against the glass, layered over the city beyond. And for a brief second, she studied it, not critically, not nostalgically, just as it was, a presence that no longer needed to be defined by where it came from. And her mind drifted, not into the past, but through it, Moments that had once felt heavy now distant. Conversations that had shaped her now quiet, because they no longer held relevance, and she understood something then, not as a realization, but as a confirmation, that what had changed was not the room, not the company, not even the people around her. It was the absence of needing to be validated within them, and that absence had created space, and in that space, everything else had aligned naturally, and outside, the city continued its movement, unaware, unchanged, but inside, the structure had shifted in a way that would ripple far beyond this building. And Emily Carter stood there for a moment longer, not holding on to the moment, not marking it as significant, because significance was something others assigned, not something she needed to define. And as the light began to soften slightly toward evening, she turned back toward her desk, already moving forward, because what came next was not something she would wait for. It was something she would continue to shape, step by step, without noise, without hesitation, without looking back. Evening arrived without announcement, the light outside softening into a muted glow that reflected against the glass walls of the office, turning sharp lines into something quieter, more fluid. And Emily Carter remained at her desk, the final hours of the day unfolding with the same controlled rhythm that had defined everything since morning, not rushed, not lingering, just precise. And as the city shifted into its nighttime cadence, the building around her did the same, conversations thinning, footsteps becoming less frequent, the hum of activity lowering into something more focused, more intentional. And on her screen, the last set of reports for the day sat open, projections already adjusted, inefficiencies marked, future decisions outlined with a clarity that left little room for interpretation, and she reviewed them not out of obligation, but out of discipline. Because consistency was what turned change into permanence. And as she reached the final page, a reflection moved, faintly in the glass behind her, not startling, not unexpected, just there, and she did not turn immediately, allowing the presence to settle before acknowledging it, because timing, even in something as small as a glance, still mattered. And when she finally shifted her gaze, she saw him standing just inside the doorway, not fully entering, not retreating. Ryan Whitmore, his posture composed but quieter than before, as if the absence of control had reshaped the way he occupied space. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer charged, no longer unresolved, just existing, complete in its own way. And then he stepped forward slightly, not to reclaim anything, but simply to close the distance that remained. The directives went through, he said, his voice even, not questioning, not resisting, just acknowledging. And Emily nodded once, her attention returning briefly to the screen before settling back on him. They did, she replied, her tone unchanged, and he studied her for a moment, not searching this time, but observing, as if trying to understand something that no longer needed explanation. And there was a pause, not empty, but measured, before he spoke again. You always saw things differently, he said, the words quiet, almost reflective, and Emily did not respond immediately, because the statement did not require agreement. It only required recognition, and after a second, she closed the file on her screen, the soft click marking the end of the day's work, not dramatically, but definitively, and she turned her chair slightly, facing him fully now, her posture relaxed, her presence steady. I saw what was there, she said, her voice calm, not what I was told to see. And the distinction was subtle, but it carried weight, the difference between perception shaped by others and clarity built from within. And Ryan's expression shifted slightly, not in disagreement, but in understanding, the kind that arrives too late to change the outcome. And he gave a small nod, the movement contained, almost private, and for a moment longer, they stood in that shared space, not as they once had been, not as something unresolved, but as two people whose paths had diverged completely. And then he stepped back, not abruptly, just enough to signal closure. Good night, Emily, he said, and the name carried no assumption now, no ownership, just acknowledgement, and she inclined her head slightly. Good night, she replied, and that was it. No further words, no lingering tension, just an ending that did not need to be spoken aloud. And as he turned and left, the door closing softly behind him, the room returned to stillness, the kind that followed something complete. And Emily Carter remained there for a moment, not holding on to anything, not revisiting what had passed, just existing in the quiet certainty of what had already been decided. And outside, the city lights stretched into the distance, steady, constant, reflecting a world that never stopped moving, and neither did she.